Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for following us online today. And today is our great pleasure and honor to have Professor David Christian, the director of Big History Institute and the professor in Macquarie University in Australia. And he is also the author of Origin Story, one of the bestseller, and also many books of author in terms of history, and also like the founder of that the Big History this subject. So it's really great to have you with us, Professor Christian. So right. So before we begin our interview today, may we get maybe a few minutes from you to have your maybe brief introduction, maybe more about your work, and also about something that you want to share with our audience in China.
Right. Well, I grew up. I was a child in Nigeria. I grew up in England. I went to university in England, but I have lived most of my adult life in Sydney, in Australia. And for many years, I taught Russian and Soviet history. So I'm really a Russian historian originally, and I actually lived in the Soviet Union in the Brezhnev years. I was a student in Leningrad. And so I taught Russian history for many years. But then eventually I began to feel that it was more and more important to teach about the history of humanity. And so I began to wonder how you could teach the history of all of humanity. And I realized that to do that, you have to start with the Paleolithic era, 200,000 years ago. You have to, and most university courses in history, they don't talk about the Paleolithic era at all, but it's immensely important. It's the foundation for human history. And in fact, the era we live in today is very different from most of human history. It's much more dynamic, change is much more rapid, there are more humans on Earth. So it's a very strange era we live in. So I began to think, how could you teach the history of humanity? And then I realized that you would have to talk about the evolution of human beings. And I realized that means talking about biology. And to understand the evolution of human beings, you have to understand the evolution of multicellular organisms. And to do that, you have to understand the origins of life on Earth. And then I realized that you have to understand something about planet Earth, how it was formed. So you have to understand some geology as well, and some astronomy, and then back and back and back until eventually I realized that the beginning of the story was really the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago. So I wondered if it was possible to teach a university course that began with the Big Bang and included the whole of history, so that we could see how human history fits into the history of the universe. And that's how I began teaching Big History. And I've now been teaching it for over 30 years.
Right, thank you, Professor Christian. It's very impressive to hear that you were growing up in so many diversified culture from Nigeria and in many of country, and you also, since you also teach for Soviet history. I shall greeting you. Здравствуйте. Давайте познакомимся. Меня зовут Андрей.
Вы говорите по-русски.
Очень приятно. This is the Russian I can speak only a little. Yeah, so I think it's very good and also let our audience to have more understanding in terms of why you begin the research on Big History. So by the definition, maybe the first question we would really like to get your perspective is what is big history? And also how do you differentiate that the history we learn from the school traditionally? For example, that the history that we learn from our teacher at the junior high school or high school level, and also what discipline are considered to be relevant to big history.
Right. Well, how I define big history, I think of big history as like a modern scientific origin story. And that's why I called my book Origin Story. In English, origin story, I don't know how it works in Chinese.
Right.
But in English, the phrase origin story really means the sort of stories that were told by indigenous people. And they were stories that told about how everything came to be as it is, how the world was created, how humans were created. So that what they do is they bring together the best knowledge of a particular society. Now, it might be an Aboriginal society, it might be China 2000 years ago, or in the era of Confucius. It doesn't matter. Origin stories have existed in all societies, and they are immensely important because they help you see the links between all sorts of knowledge, many different kinds of knowledge. And they also help you understand your place in the universe. So I think of big history as a modern origin story,
Right.
as an origin story for a time in history when all humans are now linked, like this conversation.
Yes.
It's astonishing. You know, we can talk to each other as if we were standing next to each other. And yet we are, you know, there's a third of the world between us.
Right.
So we live in a world that's linked globally. So humanity is united in a way it never was before. And it's also a scientific world, a world with immense scientific knowledge. So I thought, is it possible to teach a sort of origin story that's based on the best scientific knowledge of today? And that means borrowing from cosmology, from astronomy, from geology, from biology, from anthropology, as well as from history. And for
Right.
students, I think it's a great way of seeing the links between different forms of knowledge. And also seeing what their place is in the universe, seeing the place of this planet in the solar system or in the galaxy or in the universe, and seeing their own place in the planet. And there's one final reason why I think it's so important, is that we live at a critical turning point in human history. We are now as a species so powerful that what we do, 8 billion humans, what we do in the next 20, 30, or 100 years will change planet Earth for millions of years. We are now so powerful that it's as if we control planet Earth. So this is a critical turning point in human history. So it's very important that young people see that. But if you teach conventional history, if I teach, you know, Australian history over the last 100 years, or Chinese history over the last 100 years, or Russian history, they won't see that. They won't see this turning point in planetary history. So that's a very long definition of what I mean by big history. But basically, I think of it as a modern science-based origin story.
Right. Thank you, Professor Christian. I think it's very impressive that you mentioned it's the way how we see that the place of our planet in the Earth, in the universe. Because I think most people, when we talk about the history, when we discuss about the history, normally people connect it to maybe the World War II, the World War I, or maybe like the conflict between the countries. So it's all about the human being. And maybe people put less concentration on the discussion for those of the age without a human being. So I think it's very important, especially nowadays, if we look at the American entrepreneur, Elon Musk is starting to explore the tour or the trip to the outer space. So I think that will be very meaningful, which means that we are not only focusing on the history in terms of what happening in the Earth, but also what happening in more general, to have more general picture of the whole universe. So really, thank you very much for that.
Can I give you another way of describing it? I sometimes think that if you're a teacher, it's a bit like being a tour guide. So if I teach chemistry, maybe I lead my students into the world of water or oxygen or hydrogen and chemical reactions. If I'm a teacher of Russian history, I lead them into the world of Russia. Now that's very important. But at some point, I think as a teacher, it's as if I need to take them to the top of the mountain. Right. And if I take them to the top of the mountain, they will lose the details, but they'll see something new that they couldn't see otherwise. What they'll see is how everything fits together. So that's another way of thinking about big history. It's like the view from the top of the mountain.
Right, right. I also have shared the same feeling when I read your book. It not only gives me like a lot of the knowledge in terms of the history, but I think it's much more like to see the beauty of the universe and the beauty of the life. So really appreciate for your contribution for that. So
and the beauty of science, I was going to say, you know, our knowledge today is so astonishing. It is a beautiful thing that we actually know something about what happened in the universe 13.8 billion years ago. And we really do have pretty good knowledge of that. That's amazing, I think.
Yes, yes, exactly. So when we read your book, we saw that you identify 8 key thresholds in terms of the universe in the last 30.8 billion years. So how do you identify those thresholds addressed in your book? In other words, what makes those thresholds qualify to be a chapter in your book?
How did I organize the book, do you mean?
How do you identify those 8 thresholds? What kind of the qualification to become a threshold?
Look, well, let me stand back a bit and explain that when I first began teaching big history, I had no idea what I was doing. I listened to lots of lectures from astronomers and geologists and biologists, and it was a mess. I didn't understand it. But then slowly over several years, I began to see a story. And that story was about a universe that began very simple. Just after the Big Bang, the universe contained hydrogen and helium and energy and light and nothing else. No stars, no galaxies, no planets, no chemicals. So the story is about a universe in which slowly, from a very simple beginning, you got more and more complex things. And that's about us, because modern human society is very, very complex. Now, I haven't forgotten about the thresholds, because this is where the thresholds come in. So how do you tell that story? Well, eventually I realized that it's very important not to have too much detail, because otherwise it's just very confusing.
Right.
So you have to stay with the central storyline.
Right.
And eventually I decided that the best way of teaching this was to pick on a number of points in the story where something new appeared, something more complex. And those are the thresholds. Now, they're a bit arbitrary. I picked 8. You could pick 10 or 20 or 100. I think they're pretty good. They work pretty well for teaching. And of course, they're linked with each other. The first threshold is the creation of the universe. The second is the creation of stars. The third is the creation inside dying stars of new chemical elements, and so on, up to modern human society. So I'm not sure that the logic is really scientific. It's partly scientific. Each threshold is scientifically important, but the logic of the thresholds is really the logic of a teacher trying to find the clearest way of telling a story. And you will have noticed that there are 8 thresholds. 3 of them are about human beings. Now, from a scientific perspective, that's a bit foolish, because humans appear very late in the story. But of course, all of my students are human beings, and I'm a human being. So that's the part of the story that's most interesting for us. And that's why human beings, we spend more time talking about human beings than we probably should, because in a sense, we're not very important in the universe.
Right.
So that's the logic of the thresholds. It's like different chapter headings in a book. It's a way of making the story clear. You know, there are many, and one of the interesting things in teaching big history is that you can say to students, do you think there are other things in this story that should be thresholds? And very often they'll say, why isn't this a threshold? You know, for example, 600 million years ago is when on Earth there appeared the first multicellular organisms. Should that be a threshold? Right. Or 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the first cities and states appeared. And soon after, you know, you have the Shang dynasty in China, and right. You have states appearing in northern India. Should that be a threshold? Now, to me, it doesn't matter. It's an interesting question. So there are a sort of organizational structure.
Right, right, right. Thank you very much for that. And following on the previous question, we will also very much like to get your perspective on that. Because as you mentioned, the last threshold that you address in your book is related to human being. So as we know, most historians conduct the study in terms of investigation, in terms of analyze or the debate about specific event. And mostly the main actor is human being. So origin story studies the whole of the history, from the Big Bang through the present day and even into the future. So what kind of lesson learned from the age of Earth without human being? Would you like to maybe give our audience some perspective or the general picture on that?
Well, I'll give my perspective, and I'm never sure whether it's really correct or not. But
Right.
If you study just Russian history, say, or just Chinese history,
Yes.
You won't learn about humanity as a whole. To study something, you have to go outside it.
Mm.
To understand Australia, I have to travel outside of Australia. The same with humanity. To understand what makes us so strange, and we're a very strange species, you have to look at other species. You have to see us in context. Now, big history can do that. It can talk about the whole history of life on Earth, and then it can say, is there something different about us as human beings?
Right.
Now, I believe that if your perspective is wide enough, then the differences can be seen very clearly. And I think the main one is what I call collective learning. We are living organisms, have been on Earth for 4 billion years. And they evolve according to the rules that Darwin explained. But we are the first species in 4 billion years that can talk the way we're talking now. So what it means is we can exchange information. I can, you can move information from your head into my head, even though we're sitting thousands of miles apart. And I can do the same. Now, we're the first species that can do that. Chimpanzees, who are very, very clever, they're very intelligent creatures, they can't do that. A mother chimp can maybe show her baby how to put a stick inside a termite mound and eat the ants, but they can't talk. So this is unique. Now, once you have a species whose members can talk, then it means that if I have a very clever idea and I talk to you about it, then you may tell someone else. Now, if I die, that idea survives in the community, so that we learn not as individuals. Chimps learn as individuals, but we humans learn collectively. So each of us has access to a colossal amount of information that was produced by billions of other humans and is now stored in books, in electronic forms, in the cloud, in the minds of other people. And that's what makes us so powerful, because it means that information has grown from generation to generation. Now, that doesn't happen with chimps. Chimp technology has not changed significantly in 1 million years. Human technology grows and changes and keeps evolving and is becoming more and more powerful, until today we are so powerful that we have the power, if we're foolish enough, to destroy the biosphere in 24 hours. If there's a nuclear war, we will destroy the biosphere in 24 hours. No other species has had that power. Or if we're clever and we're smart, we have the power to build a sustainable future. And that is what makes us unique. And we're the first species in 4 billion years that can do this. And that's why I say that we live at a turning point in the history of planet Earth. And I believe that big history is important, because if you teach history in the conventional way, you cannot see this. You need to go to the top of the mountain to see what is really happening in the world. Now, I think nowadays, many, many people do understand what's happening. But I think we also need to teach it in our schools and in our universities, and we're not teaching it.
Right, right. Right. Yes, I quite agree with you because the collective memory or the collective learning is obviously like the skill that only human beings have. But if that we only learn all the history regarding the human being, maybe we couldn't really identify this is really the skill is very unique, and maybe we only take it for granted. So I think it's very important to have the big picture.
I mean, one other way of putting it is to say that, you know, in the past, people identified with their tribes. Then people began to identify as members of a nation. You know, so my identity would be, I've lived in so many countries that I don't have a strong feeling of nationalism, but you know, if you're a Russian, you identify as Russian. If you're Chinese, you identify as Chinese. And those national identities are still tribal. And if in our schools and universities, we teach students mainly national history, what we're teaching them is a sort of secret message. And that message is that the most important community in the world is your tribe. And it's a message that divides people. Now, in the past, that was acceptable. But in an era with nuclear weapons, I don't think that is any longer acceptable. We need to be teaching humans that what they share, it doesn't matter whether you're Chinese or American or Australian or Russian or Brazilian, what they share is, you know, the inner life of each of us is so similar in many ways. And we need to teach what we share as human beings. And amongst the things we share problems, global problems that we have to solve together. And we also share global possibilities and opportunities.
Right. I think it's particularly very important given that in the last 3-5 years, we also see the trend deglobalization happening in the world, and also the protectionism and the nationalism. So I think maybe if those citizens or the citizen in the world having the opportunity to get the access from the big history, perhaps that can give them additional or alternative channel for thinking of the world. So thank you very much.
I say that I'm not opposed to nationalism. If you're Chinese, it's immensely important that you learn about, you know, China's rich cultural history. If you're Australian, it's important that you learn about Australia's history, which is a history, by the way, of 70,000 years. People have been in Australia for 70,000 years, and probably in China quite as long. So I'm not against nationalism, but I think it's very important that we teach human history as well.
Right. Okay. So thank you very much for Professor Christian giving us very large and comprehensive landscape in terms of the history. So the next question, we will also very much like to get your perspective in terms of the 8 thresholds that mentioned, addressed in your book. Which one do you think is particularly important compared with others? Let's say, of course, maybe each threshold is connected to the next one, and it's also the foundation of the next one. But I assume maybe there is a critical one will be very helpful for accelerating the development for the further. Do you agree with that?
In a sense, you're quite right. All the thresholds belong together. They're part of one story. It's a bit like saying, you know, what's most important, your arms or your legs or your head? they all belong together.
Yes.
But from the point of view of humans living now, I think it's the last threshold that's most important. It's, I call it in Origin Story, the threshold of the Anthropocene. It's the point in human history where we have become so powerful that we can change the planet. And that means that as a species, we have immense power. That means we have immense responsibilities, and we need to understand those responsibilities to preserve the planet for my grandchildren and your grandchildren and their grandchildren, for future generations. So if I had to answer the question, I'd say for us humans, obviously, the eighth threshold of today's world is the most important. But from another perspective, you could say that the first threshold, the Big Bang, is the most important, because without the Big Bang, there's no story.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for that. So the next one, we will also like to get your perspective. Do you see any difference in terms of threshold among planets? Because we know we have the Earth, and probably other planets they also experience some of the threshold, but maybe not at all. So do you see any difference among the planet for that? Or do you envisage any divergence for the development of a planet?
Well, I mean, if you look at the different planets on Earth, one of the great questions in big history is, why did life appear on Earth? So this is the great difference.
Yes.
Our planet is what we call a Goldilocks planet. Do you understand? Goldilocks is an English children's story about, she's a young girl. She goes into the woods and she finds a house, and she goes into it and it's empty, and she finds 3 chairs, and one is very big and one is too small, but one is just the right size. And then she finds 3 beds, and one is too big, one is too small, but one is just the right size. And it turns out this is the house of 3 bears. But the point is that a Goldilocks planet is a planet that's just right. And big history is full of Goldilocks moments. Stars are just right for making new chemical elements. Some planets seem to be just right for making life. So what was it about planet Earth that made life possible? And that's one of the great questions. And we know part of the answer. Its orbit is fairly stable, so it doesn't get too hot and too cold. It's got the right temperature. It has liquid water. It's a solid planet, so it has lots of different chemical ingredients. But then we can look at the other planets, and again, students love these questions about whether there is life somewhere else in the cosmos. Yes. And they're very important questions, but they're also questions that nowadays we can talk about scientifically. When I was a kid, the question, is there life in the universe, was not a scientific question. We didn't have enough data. Now we have a lot more data. And scientists are beginning to think that there may have been life on Mars at one time. Not humans, but bacteria of some kind. There may even have been life on Venus. There may be life on Europa, which is, I believe it's a planet of Saturn. And we now know that there are billions of Earth-like planets in the galaxy. So right now it looks as if there may be lots of planets in the galaxy that could have crossed that threshold. I call it threshold 5, that created life. But we don't know yet. But one of the exciting things is that maybe in the next 10 or 20 years,
Right.
we will detect evidence of life on planets around nearby star systems, because our observatories are getting so good that they can tell what sort of gases are in the atmosphere. And some gases are a clear sign of life, such as methane.
Right.
Yeah, so the question whether the same thresholds are being crossed on other planets is very interesting. And the other question, whether creatures like us have evolved. I mean, maybe there are lots of planets that have bacteria,
Right.
tiny organisms or viruses, but how many have large complex organisms? Probably many fewer. And then the question is, if there are any organisms as clever as us that can maybe talk, do collective learning, build telescopes or radios, why haven't we detected any of them? And one of the possibilities, of course, is that a species that gets that clever will also build nuclear weapons and destroy itself. Now, we have to hope that that's not true. But it's a sort of warning story. We have not yet heard from any other species like us. And that's one possible explanation.
Right. So thank you very much for Professor Christian. So I think the next question we will also very much like to, given that you mentioned the nuclear weapon. So do you see any other internal factor that leads a planet cross the threshold? Maybe for the nuclear weapon is that the species destroy themselves. But maybe this question is like, do you see any internal factor that this planet easily or efficiently cross the threshold? For example, we learn from the origin story that the collective memory made human beings so unique compared with other species. So I saw that is agriculture as threshold at the modern revolution. So any other internal factor that do you see based on your research?
Sorry, you cut out. You dropped out for a moment. So I didn't quite hear the question.
Right. So the question is, do you see any internal factor that could help a planet to cross the threshold? For example, we human beings have the collective memory, collective learning that is very helpful for agriculture and also modern society development.
Well, collective learning, if I'm right, collective learning is what makes us different. Now, it's not a good thing or a bad thing.
Right.
It's a unique quality of our species that makes us very powerful. But we will have the choice about how we use that power.
Yes.
So we don't know, but collective learning means we both have the power to do dangerous things and the power to do good things. When I think of, for example, there are many good things. There are agreements that have controlled nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I was a schoolboy in England during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I don't know if during that crisis in 1962, John F. Kennedy was asked by journalists, how close did we come to an all-out nuclear war? He said between 1 and 2 and 1 and 3. In other words, we came very close. I was a schoolboy in England,
Right.
and I actually thought we were going to die.
Right.
So we have come very close. But the good news is that politicians since then have understood that to launch a nuclear war is crazy because it's suicide.
Right.
But that doesn't mean there won't be accidents. It doesn't mean that a crazy person won't launch them. So they're very dangerous things. But then the other side, you look at the science. You look at the I went to Tianjin 2 years ago. Shenzhen, over the border from Hong Kong. I was astonished. It's, you know, as a sort of example of the most sophisticated modern technology. It's an amazing place. And we now know so much about global warming, for example, about climate change. When I was a child, no one talked about it. So now we know a huge amount about it. And I suspect we have the knowledge we need to build a more sustainable world. I think we have the technology and we have the knowledge. What is missing is the political will. And I think it's missing everywhere in the world. There are lots of politicians who talk about climate change, but the political will is not yet there. Now, I hope things are changing. So back to collective learning. Collective learning is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's given us, it's created the technologies that make us dangerous. But if there is a solution, it will also be technological, I believe. So we have, this is a responsibility. We have the power of collective learning. We have to use it in the best possible way. And we don't know what will happen because people are unpredictable.
Right. So I think in this discussion, we maybe mainly focusing on maybe the internal factor. For example, the problem will be caused by human being, or maybe the positive solution that offered by the collective learning. So how would you like to see the external factor? For example, we know the extinction of dinosaurs might be probably caused by asteroid impact, and that probably also offer human being an opportunity to become prosperous in Earth. So what kind of external factor that you may probably want to highlight for the audience?
Yeah, there's now some very good literature on what in English are called existential risks, both external and internal. Now, a pandemic, of course, is one of them. But it looks as if, despite the huge number of deaths caused by this pandemic, it looks as if we have the skills needed to manage something like that. And an asteroid impact is a very rare thing, and astronomers can calculate pretty well how likely it is. They actually, some astronomers just study asteroids, and they, in particular, they study those asteroids that are on orbits that bring them close to the Earth. And at the moment, we know of none that look dangerous. So I don't think that's a problem. I think at the moment, the big dangers we face are really caused by us. global warming, the fact that the oceans are warming. Now that is very, very scary, because a lot of the increased heat from global warming is being absorbed by the oceans. Eventually the oceans won't be able to absorb it, and they may warm up very quickly. That will kill a lot of species.
Right.
But it'll also mean that sea levels rise. So there are some things that could happen really quite quickly. Another is in the north, the northern parts of the earth, the tundra lands. If they warm up, they will release huge amounts of methane. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas.
Right.
So the rates of climate change could speed up very suddenly. And we just don't know when we hit a tipping point. So at the moment, I think the external threats, an asteroid, the arrival of a sort of very dangerous species from another star system, I think these are nice ideas, but I don't think we need to take them too seriously. The things we do need to take seriously are the problems really caused by us humans. There is a positive way of looking at all of this, which is that the fossil fuels revolution, the last 2 centuries, there's a very positive side to this. Billions of people now live better lives, they have more food, they have better health, and this has happened particularly fast recently in China, I think, than ever before. So there are many people living in poverty, but there are many people living good lives today. Maybe fossil fuels enabled these changes. If now we can find a way of maintaining all the benefits of the modern world without fossil fuels, then that is a very good outcome for all of this. And I think it's not impossible, because the sustainable technologies are developing very, very fast indeed. And China's making a huge contribution to this process.
Right. So thank you very much, Professor Christian. So the final interview question for today's webinar is really want to get your perspective. How do you envisage the future of our planet?
Yeah, I have 2 grandchildren.
Also the last 3 threshold. Right.
I have 2 grandchildren, and my daughter is pregnant, so I will have another grandchild. So I think a lot about the future of my grandchildren. And I think there's a very good chance that we can avoid the worst scenarios. I think it's inevitable that there will be big problems. War is not going to stop overnight. But I can also see many, many hopeful signs that we can build a sustainable society. And in a sustainable society, I think it's possible that people will spend less time trying to earn money and more time trying to live a good life. Now, if I'm right, that's a very good future. It's a future in which collective learning, science, technology have created the foundations for a good life for many, many people. Maybe that's a bit utopian, but it's not impossible.
Right. So thank you very much for Professor Christian. I really appreciate for your comprehensive landscape for the big history, and also as a big fan of your book, I really learned a lot from you. So really appreciate. So here with that, we would like to turn to the question from our online audience. So here we got the first one is the question is Anthropocene unique? As far as we know, there is no similar phenomenon in other planets, at least at the moment. So do you think that the Anthropocene is unique compared with other planets in the universe?
Is the Anthropocene unique? Was that the question?
Yes.
Yes. Look, it's a great question, and we discussed it a bit. There is, as you may know, a new scientific discipline called astrobiology. Now, I don't know whether there are many astrobiologists in China, but they study the problem of life on other planets. And at the moment, I think there are 2 or 3 things we can say, and I said them briefly earlier. One is, it looks very likely that there are lots of planets that have life, but we're talking about bacteria, microbes.
Right.
Chances of multicellular life, of large organisms, are much, much smaller. But if it's true that there are billions of Earth-like planets just in our galaxy, then it seems quite likely that on some of those planets, large organisms have evolved. So then the question is, what are the chances that some of those organisms acquired a skill like collective learning? Because the Anthropocene is impossible without collective learning. And the truth is, we don't know, of course.
Right.
There's a famous equation, the Drake equation, which you may have heard of. It's a series of questions about how many Earth-like planets are there, how many of them have stable orbits, how many of them have water, and so on and so on. And the trouble is, we don't really know the answer to those questions. But as I said before, one of the most intriguing speculations, this is not really science, but it's a speculative idea, is that every planet on which you get a species like us faces a crisis when that species becomes so powerful that it controls the planet. Because now that species has to learn how to manage an entire planet. Can we do that? If there are other planets, are there other planets where there has been an Anthropocene? If so, did they learn to manage their planet well, or did they destroy themselves? And of course, we don't know the answer to that question. Right. But we do have some control over the answer on this planet.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Christian. So let me see the second selected question from our audience. Okay, so here is the second one. As Elon Musk is quite ambitious for exploring the outer space, how do you envisage the life is going to be there in the outer space? Or what kind of challenges in terms of for the human being to live in another planet?
Yeah. Well, I think we can be pretty sure that human beings will colonize space. They will, in the next 20 years or so, they will create colonies on the moon, maybe on asteroids, maybe on Mars. The challenges are huge, absolutely huge, and we underestimate them. Living on Mars will be much, much harder than living in Antarctica. It's like Antarctica with no oxygen. So it's extraordinarily difficult. And some people say that moving to other planets will be the solution if we make a mess of this planet. Now, personally, I think that's crazy. Because we make a mess of this planet and we move to Mars, then we will make a mess of Mars and then we'll just move on. So, but I'm not the person to give a good answer to that question. It's there's now lots of speculation about how people might live on huge space stations for many generations. It will take, at the moment, we don't have rockets powerful enough to reach the nearest star systems. It would take 1,000 years or something like that. So exploration beyond Earth is probably going to be exploration of the solar system for maybe many generations, unless there's some astonishing breakthrough. But my own feeling is that I enjoy science fiction and I love thinking about these things. But I think that what we really need to be thinking about is making sure that we have a good future on planet Earth. It's a very good place, by the way. You wouldn't want to live on Mars or Mercury or Venus. They're horrible places. Earth is a really good place to live. And you remember those wonderful pictures from the first people in space who took photographs of the Earth. I think those pictures showed us what a sort of beautiful place we humans share with many other species. So one of the best reasons, one of the things that'll happen when we start traveling is we'll start to realize what a great place Earth is, I think.
Yes. So thank you very much for that. I think that we have the last question from the audience. But this question, I think, is also a little bit like the science fiction. The audience is wondering, because that if we look back to our whole universe history, is 13.8 billion years long. And for example, bacteria, they live in the world for a long time. And also we have dinosaurs for ruling the whole Earth for maybe a certain period. So do you see that the human being is already achieved the highest level in terms of species? Or do you see the next level, how the ecosystem is going to be?
Yeah, well, if what I say is right, then we are at this momentous turning point where we become managers of planet Earth. So that's the challenge for us. Can we do a good job of that? But we can also, if we look, say, 1,000 or 2,000 years into the future, then there are several things we can be pretty sure about. One is that we will have colonies on other planets. But the second is that we will start changing ourselves. We will improve our brains, we will improve our eyesight, we will become more bionic. And remember, every species on Earth, it may exist for maybe 1 million years or a few 100,000 years, but then it evolves into something else. So I think if we manage to survive the next century or two, we will start changing ourselves. We will also bioengineer ourselves. We now can control our genes, of course.
Right.
So people will start creating genes for more intelligent babies. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't really know. So I think if you looked at human beings in 1,000 years' time, you might find at least some of them look really rather different from us. And certainly in 2,000 or 3,000 years. And then if you look, say, 1,000,000 years into the future, I'm not sure that you would recognize the creatures that were descended from us. They might look very different from us, not just because of evolution, but also because we now have become kind of sculptors. We can control evolution. So we will have built new forms of humans. Yeah, if you imagine someone looking back from 1,000,000 years' time, they will look at this, at us now,
Right.
living at a critical turning point, and they'll say, yeah, they did a pretty good job of learning to manage the earth, but boy, their technology were primitive.
Right.
That's my feeling. Yeah.
Right. So really appreciate Professor Christian. I think I really enjoy the talk with you today. As you mentioned in the very beginning of today's talk, let you say, being a teacher, sometimes we are like the tour guide to lead the student or audience to not only see many things in detail, but lead them to the mountain. I think when I read your book, I have the feeling that I am standing in one of the mountains. And after I talk to you, I see that I'm not only in the top of mountain, but I have opportunity in another top of mountain. So really appreciate for having this opportunity to learn a lot from you today.
And I thank you for your very interesting questions too.
Right. So really appreciate. And also today, I think we have totally 10,000, around 10,500 audience following us online today. So also really appreciate for your presence for making this happen.
Pleasure.
So once again, as we mentioned in the very beginning, I hope we have pleasure to host you in China, in our Zhejiang University in the near future, if the condition allow, or at least hoping we have opportunity to connect with you once again virtually, or maybe in Australia in the near future.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Christian. So have a lovely evening and stay in touch.
Okay. And I hope the audience enjoyed the talk.
Okay. So thank you very much. Bye.